I want to move on to this Dillon Brooks ejection for a second. The Draymond Green ejection to me was a textbook, like, I thought he deserved to get ejected. We talked about it on the show. It wasn't about the jersey pull. It's the combination. He loaded up, slapped Brandon Clark right in the face. I thought he did it deliberately as well. And then he grabbed the jersey and pulled him down. I thought that deserved an ejection. But had they kept Draymond Green in the game, wouldn't have had any problem with it. Wouldn't have been an issue. They just happened to make the ejection, and I thought that was a defensible call. This one, there was no defense for it. If they would have left him in the game, it would have been a travesty. It was an outrageously dirty play. I actually had a huge problem with Shaq and Charles Barkley going into the halftime show and talking about how he was going for the ball. No, he wasn't. Like, it was disguised like that. He swung in a trajectory where his hand was kind of in the same direction of the ball, but he wasn't even close to the ball, and he intentionally followed through on his head. Gary Payton had a clear advantage going to the rim, and Dillon Brooks made a deliberate attempt to knock him out of the air, which is frighteningly dangerous. He knew what he was doing. He knew it had a risk of injury, and it did. It hurt him. There's a chance, like, we don't know until we get the MRI, there's a chance he's got a seriously messed up elbow. And in addition to that, Gary Payton Jr. is not under contract next year. This is professional basketball. Golden State doesn't owe him anything. If he has an elbow injury that keeps him out for 6 months or something like that and ends up being an issue, he'll have to find another spot in the league potentially. That's the type of risk. That's why you don't do stuff like that, because you're messing with people's livelihoods at that point. Like, Dillon, imagine if you were in a contract year, man, and someone did that to your shooting elbow. Like, that's the kind of situation that was. And, there's this stupid dynamic, and Steve Kerr saw this coming a mile away. Steve Kerr was talking about how he expected this to be the most physical game of the series. Klay Thompson talked about it as well. Draymond Green talked about it on his show. Everyone predicted physicality. There is a massive difference between physicality and playing dirty. And I hate when I'm talking with older basketball players, guys that have been around for a long time, when guys start driving to the basket and they're like, oh, you got to knock him on his ass. You got to knock him out of the air. You got to do something to stop him from getting into the lane. And whenever I'd hear guys talk like that, I'd be like, get out of here, man. That's dirty. Playing physical is about holding your ground. Playing physical is about being the aggressor on offense, and being the aggressor in box outs, and being the aggressor when you set screens, and being the aggressor when you're driving to the basket. It's not about clobbering dudes out of midair deliberately and knocking them in a position where they're precariously falling down on their elbow. That's not basketball. That's dirty. There's no place for that. And it was deliberate. I had a huge problem with it. If it were up to me, I'd suspend him. He wouldn't be allowed to play until Gary Payton Jr. came back. But you know how that goes. It's probably not going to happen. My guess is we'll see him in game 3. But I just, it offends me personally as someone who's been around the game for a while when guys do stuff like that, because I just think it has no place in the game. And again, Dillon, imagine you're in his predicament. Imagine it's a contract year and you're literally going up to the basket, and like if you don't want to give up the basket, grab him, hold him, do anything other than what you did.
Guy comes in, whacks him across the head in midair. He broke the code. Dillon Brooks broke the code. That's how I see it.
Obviously, there's a lot to unpack there. Kerr has the, I don't know if it was intentional, but it was dirty quote. He talks about Brooks breaking the code, talks about just obviously how devastating it is for GP2 individually, given his journey. So given all that, what's your initial reaction to that from Kerr and thoughts on the play overall?
Man, Steve Kerr is a great basketball coach, but he's an exceptional human being overall as well. And I'm really glad that he was able to eloquently lay that out, because I tried to say something similar earlier in the show, and I think it just carries so much more impact coming from him. And it was so important for him to say that. Look, guys, like, I've talked about Gary Payton a lot on this show, like, in a lot of ways, like, him and I had a similar goal and we followed a similar path. We both came up through junior college and then went to 4-year schools. He was better than me. And, I'm at peace with knowing that I didn't make it because I wasn't good enough. I don't lose sleep because I feel like I got screwed over, or because I felt like some things didn't go my way that were supposed to go my way. I'm at peace with that. Gary Payton, I've been rooting for him ever since him and I crossed paths in our college basketball careers. And I've been rooting for him over the course of the last few years. I wanted the Lakers to sign him a bunch of times. And, like Steve said, like that's a tough journey, especially when you go that route. Like it's a completely different route than the route that the route that like a LeBron James goes through coming up as like a high school superstar and getting recruited. Like the grind of trying to make it in professional basketball. Like, I know a bunch of guys who are currently going through that grind overseas that have goals to try to make it back over here. I've got a buddy from Tucson, a guy named Bryce Cotton that I played with growing up, who briefly was in the league and now he's in Australia fighting there. Like there is like a kind of like a brotherhood that exists amongst all of these basketball players that are trying on this journey. And it is so incredibly difficult. And when you get that call, and you get that opportunity, it means so much. And like, again, like I told you guys earlier in the show, and I mean it from the bottom of my heart, like you don't play with that. You don't play with that. And most importantly, like to Steve Kerr's original point about there being a code, I'd argue that code extends down the line. Like in your local pickup game up at the YMCA or up at the LA Fitness or wherever it is that you play, if a guy's going up for a layup and he's in midair and you don't have a legitimate chance to block the shot, you let him go. You don't, or if you foul him in a way that's not dangerous. The reckless swinging or tackling or undercutting of a player that is flying towards the basket is completely out of line at every level of the game. And Dillon knows that. And he willingly made a conscious decision at that point to risk Gary Payton's basketball career. And he severely injured him. And he probably won't play again in this playoff run. And quite frankly, I have no interest in seeing Dillon Brooks play again in this playoff run.
So you touched on it a bit there. I mean, obviously, the first reaction has to be empathy for Gary Payton II and what this means for him. But that last comment there, what do you think is an appropriate punishment for Dillon Brooks beyond obviously just the ejection?
It's hard because, again, to Steve Kerr's original point of intentionality, I don't think Dillon Brooks intentionally tried to hurt Gary Payton, but he did intentionally make a decision that he knew carried a high risk of hurting Gary Payton Jr. And so from that, it's almost like a reckless endangerment type of deal. So, I mean, here's the thing. I think he should be suspended. The length of the suspension is super complicated because if you suspend him for the remainder of the playoffs, Memphis will freak out and probably have a right to, because that's a pretty extensive punishment for a play that, again, intentionally he wasn't trying to hurt him, right? But it was the risk involved. I would suspend him for the rest of the series, though. I think that's fair. He's going to miss somewhere between 3 and 5 games. That's a reasonable suspension in the sense that it's not so egregiously long that it's borderline like reactionary. But at the same time, it's like, hey, if you're gonna try to beat the Warriors without Gary Payton, congrats, you're gonna beat him without Dillon Brooks now because he's the one who took him out. That's the way I would do it if I was in charge.